Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate our first session as well as welcome you to our mid-year cloud security check, top emerging attacks and modern best practices summit, brought to you by Rubrik. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a Nespresso Virtual Plus Deluxe Bundle. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor, Rubrik, available on the console right now. So please download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, and we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. What's attacking your cloud today? New threats and methodologies. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax, and Chris Speaks, Head of Operations at Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. He served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch and joined the CF Military Police Reserves and retired as a public affairs officer. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst / consultant for the multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare verticals. Today, as Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax in the UK, and Chief Technical Officer of Octopi Managed Services in Canada, Ian has deep experience with the threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant, specializing in building security operations, working as a VCISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence programs for small, medium, and enterprise organizations. Chris is the head of operations for CTI company Cyjax. He's also CEO of his own company, Cyber Force Services. His experience comes from working in cybersecurity space for many years with UK law enforcement as a police detective sergeant and cybercrime specialist supporting companies through DIFIR, as well as leading specialist teams seeking to prosecute cyber criminals, including those buying and selling as a commodity on the dark web. Through his 23 years in UK law enforcement, he has worked with FBI, Homeland Security, Europol, and foreign cyber specialists, providing an international response to cybercrime. Since being at Cyjax, Chris has continued to lead the team, bringing new talent into the industry, rocking the cyber skills gap boat with new thought leadership and insight, and continues to ensure that the Cyjax operations team provides meaningful and actionable intelligence to its clients. Ian and Chris, it's great to have you guys here. Please take it away.
All right. Amazing. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. And again, just a huge shout out of appreciation to the editorial team here, as well as our sponsor, Rubrik. So, Chris, shall we get into it?
Let's do it, Ian. Great to be here.
All right. So I wanted to share with everyone that this is actually a real special webinar in that I'm in Las Vegas for Defcon, an organization that I've attended and volunteered at for, since Defcon 9, and we're at Defcon 31. So I think I might have to revise the number of years I've been involved in cybersecurity number in my bio. But what I wanted to say is one of the big news things is this incredibly technological, amazing sphere that is the entire surface is covered with LEDs. And I would suggest for a moment that this sphere, if it can survive the persistent attacks, as well as some of the world's most talented social engineers, it's going to be absolutely fit for purpose. So we're watching carefully. There was a rumor that was going around yesterday that already someone had claimed administrative rights or root access, as we call it, to Sphere. But I haven't seen any confirmation of that. And, rumors at the world's largest hacker convention, where we expect guests to be in the number of 25,000 to 30,000 people, spread like wildfire, as you can imagine. So everyone, I wanted to say, and just kind of dig down a little bit deeper with myself. Obviously, you kind of know what I'm about. I've been a regular on these webinars for a while. But I wanted to say and welcome Chris. This is his second webinar that we've done. And Chris, I think, from your perspective on the operations side, and especially when it's coming to the threat intelligence, what are sort of are customers now expecting a lot more, or are they really concerned about their digital transformation efforts and zero trust efforts getting derailed by threat actors?
They really are, Ian, and it's great to be here again. Thanks to the sponsors and for having me along for this second time. I kind of wish I was in Defcon rather than near to the Yorkshire Moors, but hey, I'll put up with this place. So we're definitely seeing the clients now coming in as they embark on a digital transformation journey with less or more knowledge, in truth, about what that involves. And then we're definitely seeing them now reaching out to find the holistic view around the threat. I'm not sure entirely they know what the threat is a lot of the time, but they expect us to know. So it puts us in a good position to provide some really credible and useful information out there. But of course, the threat landscape is huge, and from the operations team we've got running here, we take in the OSINT side, that online information from all the open and closed sources out there, all the way across to looking at physical security, which of course has some kind of bearing onto the threat, and then of course into the more traditional cyber threat intelligence sphere, looking at both your traditional threat actors, your APTs, advanced persistent threats, all the way across to your hacktivist groups, which are really prevalent at the moment. I know we'll come on to later. So they are certainly demanding a lot of information. What we try to do is just to provide relevant information. And that's what you're certainly doing with this slide deck.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to talk about that transformation because, I made fun of a little thing, security questions for our audience, is going to play up that this is sensitive information that we have in this webinar. But it's a little bit laughable in that we have, in some cases, organizations are still using this approach to security in the age where, you have amazing tools, you're able to dig down and look at which concerts toured through a city, and, based on the particular age of a person that you might be able to find from a data dump and all of the personal information. It's quite possible on their Instagram they have a picture of their first make and model of their car, and, again, you can really dig deep and find this other information. Everything from online obituaries and things like that can be used. We call that OSINT in the business, or OSINT. But I think, what has happened, and one of the central themes that we're going to cover on this webinar is really about how legacy technology that has been either deployed to the cloud, it kind of moved off of physical and into a virtual, presents a huge attack surface because of the age that we live in, where personally identifiable information has been breached over and over and over again. So the threat model has changed dramatically from the days where we used to use these security questions to try and validate an individual. And, you know, Chris, the thing that really became apparent to me is these security questions were like a single factor to try and confirm the identity. But now, you know, we need to compare that to the IP address that the individual is logging in from, based on perhaps their, the way they log in, their usual IP addresses that they log in. We have to dig a lot deeper, you know, and this is sort of like one of the reasons for multi-factor adoption. But what was interesting to me is so many people could go through these questions, and even though they were failing the answers, Chris, it wouldn't actually log any sort of detection error that the questions continue to fail, but you are basically allowed indefinite tries. So we had web systems protected by infinite ammo attempts for the bad guys to try and penetrate. Now, in this webinar, we want to really kind of... Go ahead, mate.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was just saying you're absolutely right. The beginning of the brute force attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And it persists still today. So on this agenda, we're really going to talk about, you know, a kind of a weather forecast. We at Sajax want to look forward. You know, they talk about a big movement called Defend Forward. You know, threat intelligence is part of this, anticipating threat actor behavior to either detect and completely bypass attempts by actors to gain access. You know, big stories certainly here about what happens when your cloud infrastructure is compromised, when software as a service or services are put into appliances. You know, we saw this with Barracuda ESG, as well as the exploitation of MoveIt, which we're going to discuss quite a bit in depth. We're going to talk about how threat actors have used the cloud to help launch their attacks, because, you know, what's good for your business, digital transformation, is also good for the threat actor's business, right? The context of a lot of threat actor behavior, Chris, and this is sort of the big topic, I think, is the arc of what we were dealing with post-Russian invasion to now the after about 550 plus days of war. We have seen a really interesting digital transformation of the threat actor behavior as well, with some of the groups that are operating, and Chris and I are going to get into that. And then finally, how organizations that are taking a very, I think, are taking a path to digital transformation have no idea how to defend the thing that they are just sort of putting in the cloud and saying, well, you know, the cloud, we've been told the cloud is more secure, but, you know, ultimately the security of data is a customer responsibility. So let's kick it off a little bit about, you know, why we have failure, but look at those numbers. Chris, I think one of the first insights from the report was really about how, if organizations are migrating to the cloud, is anyone surprised that the threat actors and some threat actors are specializing in this because they know that the attack surface is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger?
That's exactly right. We're all going through the same journey, whether you be a threat actor, a business, or a personal individual. And these are growth areas for threat actors as opportunity, as well as the companies through their digital transformation. And I think these figures just show the growth in both sides. And as you mentioned earlier, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war, with everything coming through digital opportunity, is just the perfect storm for mixing up a real a real problem on the horizon? Well, the problem is that the horizon's here. And I think that when you look at 85% of organizations embracing that cloud first principle by 2025, we're almost there, and yet I'm still hearing from the clients, what does this security module mean? How do we turn on auditing? How do we find out about our logs? Where do we store this? How come it costs so much? So yeah, it's a very interesting place, but it's not going to slow down.
Yeah, and you know what? This is a big takeaway because, you know, we say that there's a cybersecurity skills shortage, but yet we see organizations laying off, IT workers. I think this is because of the digital transformation to the cloud. If you don't have cloud skills and you've avoided upskilling, you're doing yourself a disservice, because I think we have to adapt to the changing times. Certainly the threat actors have. And the other thing here is that what we're consistently seeing is the difficulty that some organizations have applying security controls to cloud infrastructure. They're not sure what they should be buying. They're not sure what they're needing. And if that does sound like a shameless plug for Rubrik, it absolutely is, because you need expert guidance and counsel. This, especially at the enterprise level, Chris, where the Verizon data breach report and a lot of other cost of breach reports are pointing out that the cloud in a lot of cases is the crown jewels, or where the crown jewels are kept. And there seems to be no reluctance on businesses to put personally identifiable information into that cloud. And I think the clients that are out there, feel are not doing proper threat modeling. Would you agree, Chris?
I really would. And of course, you've mentioned the clients. Well, these are ones that are actually actively seeking cyber threat intelligence when it's our clients. And certainly for my own company, it's those companies that are looking for an opportunity to get a consultant in to talk about their first stage security. But at the moment, we're seeing that you're getting a digital transformation, a move to the cloud, and then the conversation starting about security after the fact. Well, it's too late. And as we've seen by Klopp and what we'll come on to later on, whilst we're in the cloud and there's no reluctance to put a lot of this data in the cloud, often without realization of whereabouts in the world the data is then being stored in relation to GDPR or any kind of US legislation, this is one of those points that ends up being the reason that threat actors evolve so quickly. We've got a perfect storm with them able to monetize the commodity, which is data. And that's not only for selling the data for access, but selling the data for creating identities of stolen people and just creating every kind of criminality that you can get around that. So yeah, it's just a fascinating time at the moment, but I do think there's going to be a real point that legislation will stand in to try and protect those that haven't thought about this. We're already seeing that with the necessity for CTI to come in with ISO 27001, and as that moves forward, I suspect that will move with NIST.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so one of the big takeaways from the data that we crunched. Now, let me give you some context. It is there in the resources for downloading. To support this webinar, Chris had his team look at our reporting on threat actors, and a couple of startling revelations came out of that report, including it's 2 months to Cloud Hacking Month. Tell me a little bit about why it appears that October is Cloud Hacking Month. Is it just because the threat actors need to make their fourth quarter numbers?
It could be. They've just come back from their annual leave, from their staying around in Odessa on the Black Sea down there, and they've got to make their numbers up. And it may be that we're seeing money being spent by organisations for changes with the knowledge that they've only they're halfway through the year and there's finance left for the rest of the year. seeing that start to change with that finance, opening up opportunities for digital transformation, but then very quickly being reacted to by the threat actors. It was a fascinating spike to see. It really was.
Yeah. So we've shared some of that data in the report for you folks to perusal. So, a heads up, we're giving you 2 months notices that things in the cloud are probably going to get hit. And some of the folks that are doing the attacking, as it were, are multi-cloud specialists. No question about that. But Chris, tell us a little bit about the Scarlet Teal campaign. Why are we calling it a campaign when it's been around since really the beginning of cloud, in terms of there's a grandfathers in a lot of ways of a cloud threat actor?
Yeah, I think any kind of ongoing threat has to be looked at a campaign when it evolves. We know that this one, certainly coming with Team TNT, a German-speaking group who's been around for a good while, but they're taking every opportunity they can and using Weavescope as it came in from this group to look at an easy Dockerized approach to gaining the reconnaissance of the infrastructure. This was an ongoing piece that really just showed the prevalence of a threat actor and the money that was being made by them. I think it's fair to say it was a good campaign for a good amount of time.
And if you don't quite understand the reference, it's to, of course, the AC/DC song, TNT, it's Dynamite. But I think what's really interesting is the goal of these threat actors isn't necessarily espionage, but it's to take over the infrastructure, spend as much money as you've got to generate Monero or other type of cryptocurrencies using the biggest infrastructure that they can manage to spool up in a bank holiday, or as they like to call them in the United States, a long weekend. So again, the threat actors kind of know when to strike, don't they?
They really do, and they are using automated tools to maximize what they can get from your infrastructure as well. There's no point in going in and using the human-led approach anymore of trying to pivot across an infrastructure. Just chuck in some tools, get it to tell you where the opportunity is, and make your bucks.
Right, which of course, speaking of making the bucks and causing all sorts of misery, is Clop. And Clop is a sophisticated threat actor who plotted, developed, and executed their own zero-day attacks on the MoveIt appliance. And there was another appliance that was kind of involved in that as well. What was the name of it? Do you remember off the top of your head?
I do not. Just give me two.
Okay. Anyways, this evoked quite a discussion amongst cybersecurity professionals in that there's a bunch of huge takeaways. So what Clop was able to do was develop a series of SQL injects, which have been, a bane of web servers and back-end databases since the dawn of web application attacks that have databases, which is to say almost nearly every single one of them. Right now, Progress Software has come under fire in a class action lawsuit, of course, which seems to be one of the results of having a product that fails to adequately secure personal data. But to be fair, some of this has to do with the fact that the devices would support insecure protocols to begin with, like FTP and HTTP, or HTTP, not with the S, file transfers, which, in my opinion, are not only legacy, they're incredibly dangerous, because there is no security wrapped around the data unless your mandatory data protection rules require any sort of data transfer to be encrypted with a password. For an end user, it strikes me as, unfortunately, we can't email giant files, and organizations are dealing with giant files more and more. But it sure strikes me as there's far better ways to securely move files today than using a protocol that had its early beginnings in the 1970s. So this raised, of course, my quotation that I threw out there that SQLI attacks are really about a look back into time where we used to use the idea of filters to prevent input that could be dangerous, and then advancing the programmatic approach was to start using parameterized input. So one is sort of like filtering out anything bad, and the other technique is only allowing a certain amount of things that can be inputted. And obviously you see the difference very broadly in security. And don't forget that these boxes and this secure file transfer as a service were essentially designed on original file transfer software made by a company called Ipswitch, which dates back to 2005. So a lot of this stuff seems to me to be a glorified, FTP box, which, from a security perspective, that's just a no, Chris. Like, it should be just a no.
It was just a no from the beginning, to be fair. The other piece was Fortress Go Anywhere MFT application, obviously, which I then got to. I think the interesting thing about this is that the Move It Transfer system had been patched a number of times, and yet the threat actors from this one were able to find the vulnerability just by using an HTTP session wrapper to actually completely remove the patch or the patches from the versions.
Yeah.
Which allows them effectively just to create arbitrary session variables over the HTTP header, which basically means that they removed the security patches, created a web shell, and helped themselves to the data. Back in the 1970s, that was pretty much how it worked anyway, I guess. But the interesting thing I think about...
Go ahead.
Sorry, Ian, I was going to say, the interesting thing I found about CLOP and the data we've been looking at is the security approach of companies using this file transfer protocol. And the thing about it is that in about 20 to 25% of the cases of companies that we've seen exposed by CLOP, the data that is coming through and being leaked remains encrypted. That means the rest of the data has not been encrypted when it's been put through this database. And that's just, in this day and age, the worst case scenario.
Yeah, and so we'll see what happens because, I made a comment the other day to a reporter on this in that I said that even though there's been this class action lawsuit leveled, it will be interesting to see if it's settled, which in my mind is like pleading the fifth in a criminal case, right? Because then we don't get to see behind the scenes as to what, security measures Progress Software had in place, what the evidence is to support that. So there is, I think, potentially a little bit of smoke here in that, the organization didn't make the necessarily investments into the product and potentially put organizations at risk. So there's more to follow on this one, I think. And again, there is this tendency, especially from the enterprise software, to not pen test these things, thinking that an appliance was an appliance so that, it's someone else's problem. Newsflash, it's your problem. And so any sort of edge services need to be carefully sort of monitored for anomalous behavior. But I think also you bought it or you're using it doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to protect that customer data with encryption, like you said. Now,
just because you're transferring the data doesn't mean you're transferring the risk, right?
Exactly. Now, this other was a big breaking news story from and caused a lot of drama about Microsoft and their recent sort of like dabbling, I would say, in that they're not being nearly as upfront about not only their vulnerabilities but their impact. And you can see that Amit Yoran, who is a big guy in the cyber world, who is, I believe, he's the CEO of Tripwire, one of the granddaddies of vulnerability management. He accuses Microsoft right out of a culture of toxic obfuscation when it comes to addressing security threats. And this came as a result of Microsoft's continued downplaying of the impact that Storm 0558 had, which is the threat actor, on getting some sort of master token, excuse me, that allowed them to gain access to. Now, the good news about Storm 0558 is they were full-on Chinese-backed espionage actors, if I recall. They are Chinese, related to China, correct?
Yeah, they're a Chinese APT, absolutely right, targeting government agencies across Western Europe.
Exactly. And so they embarked on a campaign that we don't even know the level of, I think, depth, because Microsoft has not been particularly transparent at this. And this was a big deal. And in off-the-record comments with some of the people that I've run into at Defcon, they said that this was a very serious breach. And they also pointed out that a very serious breach occurred, very similar in technique, apparently called the Golden Sample ticket, back in the wake of the SolarWinds data breach. And it feels like ever since that, Microsoft has become less and less transparent about the massive impact that their cloud services present in terms of risk to organizations. And that allows us to even talk about these folks who have taken a DoorDash approach to malware delivery. Why don't, Chris, you kind of walk us through, like, this is kind of a really interesting thing where cloud services are actually being used to dump payloads on organizations, indicating that cloud storage service may have some security gaps that organizations are unaware of.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of reasons why the threat actors are making use of the cloud services, including the availability of rapid put-up, take-down options from the cloud. They can chuck it up, use it as C2, take it down, coordinate across their botnets, or just exfiltrate data straight to it. And they also know full well that law enforcement struggles to get data from quite a few of those cloud providers. So when you start running through the use of some of the names you've got on the screen here, yeah, certainly your Western law enforcement aren't going to get an awful lot of data from them quickly. So it adds a safety layer to what the threat actors are doing. And we're seeing, of course, the use of Telegram bots and Telegram infrastructure now also being used as C2. And it's just going to continue to rise through the anonymous nature of that platform.
Yeah, and it is also interesting to me because some organizations have moved very quickly when it was determined that they were responsible for hosting malware. Wayback Machine, Discord, cyber criminals will find sort of any potential file hosting or file service platform, even if it's not their primary sort of role. It's just one of those things that can be done with that particular platform, including GitHub, to deposit payloads on compromised endpoints. So we feel, I think, that this is going to increase. I threw some stats down showing that increase of about 4%, a significant amount, about 4% growth over the last 12 months. So we threw North Korea, of course, and Iran up there are some examples threat actors that are using this technique. Now, I did promise that we would talk a little about the war. We're going to mention the war, the reference to Monty Python skit from way back in the day. We saw a really interesting change in terms of threat actor attacks resorting to DDoS on Microsoft, who initially denied that it happened, that they invented some sort of kind of, I think, excuse, that, it was a configuration error that caused this almost global outage. Chris, do you want to talk about one of our favorite threat actors, which is Anonymous Sudan?
Yeah, Anonymous Sudan, Storm 1359 from memory, actually, as their delegation. Yeah, no, they caused a heck of a lot of problems and still are. Now, whether they are Russian-fronted or Russian sympathizers is difficult to tell. We suspect Russian-fronted. And it's one of those small threat actor groups that have really shown their ability to maximize disruption through, well, now mainly layer 7 sort of application layer attacks. And we're seeing the success come from these attacks because they're using combinations of methods, including the sort of HTTP floods and cache bypass slow loris attacks all at once, as opposed to the traditional layer 4 DDoS that would have been through to the transport layer. And I think Anonymous Sudan have really shown through the last 12 months their ability to disrupt some fairly major players and indeed countries now as well. We've seen them starting to target Kenya. We've seen them previously targeting other places across the Middle East. Interestingly, tying up very, very, very usefully with some of the thoughts around Wagner at the time and their movement. So I had my suspicions that Anonymous Sudan might have been a Wagner cyber team at the time, but it's possibly not the case. But yeah, Anonymous Sudan did manage to come in and disrupt significantly the infrastructure of Microsoft. And yeah, there were some interesting excuses put up for that one. And they've continued to grow. Now, they're doing it by botnets and DDoS as a service. Now, I think this is where we found a really interesting change and development, evolution almost, of that DDoS tactic. And that DDoS as a service, where infrastructure is on a day rate, on a month rate, available through wide IP spaces, attacking from cloud spaces, maximizing the amount of IP range that can be used, and of course minimizing the amount of blacklist IPs that then come through from IOCs. So yeah, an absolutely fascinating group to watch come through, and I suspect they will carry on being very busy for us in the near future.
Didn't they actually admit in one of their public kind of announcements back in the day that they literally were stopping an attack because they ran out of money?
That was it. That was exactly right. Yeah. They ran out of money. I think the compromise card maybe they were using to top up the DDoS as a service reached its maximum limit.
Maximum. Yeah, a fascinating look at a threat actor that, we kind of joked, but they seem to be pretty serious. And I think, I was thinking about, okay, what does this really come down to? Well, it comes down to a threat actor finding that chink in the armor, finding that misconfigured HTTP service or HTTPS service, but also perhaps digging deeply into the DNS infrastructure to find things that might be susceptible to DDoS attacks because of the hybrid cloud world that we live in, where your inside might be required to support outside services, but you've got Cloudflares, you've got Windows web application firewalls. But if there are APIs that aren't that don't have ACLs or access control lists or are susceptible to overwhelming traffic, it can bring you down just as hard. Right? And that's what I think this threat model of DDoS attacks, which you would think, by moving your infrastructure to the cloud, you would almost completely mitigate, because we see the reports, blah, 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 Amazon AWS has, prevented a 3 terabit per second, DDoS attack. Yeah, that might be on the front end, but if your back end, is supported by a 100 megabit symmetrical DSL connection, that can be overwhelmed really quickly. And then that might have repercussions for that front end that you have in the cloud. So it's really something to think about. And this is, I think, a key takeaway from this is you have to take a good solid look at that hybrid cloud architecture in order to ward off a threat actor that may know more about your infrastructure than you do.
Ian, before you move on as well, and let's not forget on this one, and when we're talking about the evolution of threat actors, I think it's Avos Locker, isn't it, that are now looking at triple extortion techniques. They are encrypting your data, giving extortion, blackmail to unencrypt your data, or they will leak the data, so they're bringing up that dual threat. And now the triple extortion method of saying, okay, not only are we going to leak your data, but we're also going to DDoS your infrastructure to stop your clients, stop your customers, stop prospects coming through. So you're seeing that triple extortion level now with the DDoS on top.
And then maybe we'll move to quadruple extortion, because we'll tell the regulator, or quintuple extortion, where not only will we tell the regulator, but we're now going to we're going to sell your data to another threat actor. Mm-hmm. So the innovation continues on how bad it gets. Now, the interesting counterpoint to this is we have clients that are very interested in the type of data that's being linked from third parties. Okay, we won't name those third parties, but let's just say there is a website where you can go to, and Klopp will, tell you gleefully about all of the damage they've done and who they've penetrated. But it was interesting because it was unbelievably frustrating for an organization to try and get their hands on the actual data that the threat actor had leaked. So, it's sort of an interesting quandary. It's like, is it really leaked if no threat researcher can actually access it, right, in a timely manner? So we also saw, as a result of that struggle over using, Tor proxies and that kind of thing, we saw an interesting new development of clear websites now to distribute the stolen files? You want to talk a little bit about that? Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. The failure with Klopp from their ransomware and their data extraction through the Move It thing was the infrastructure they had behind them. It clearly failed when more than 3.5 people tried to download the data to see what that exposure was. And so we saw, I suspect, because they were crossing some, the interesting thing with Klopp is that they were originally thought to be within Ukraine. So were we seeing infrastructure come up and down with the Ukrainian attacks that continued? We just don't know on that one. But yeah, absolutely. It almost changed the risk with the data leak through the fact that Klopp couldn't actually get it out to people. And they've gone, as you said, through to a clear website, which they started to try to use for the PwC data that was leaked. And then they moved, in fact, now to a torrenting site. Let's do it the old-fashioned way, Pirate Bay type fashion. They've moved to this. They've moved to this torrenting site to try and get data out in a more effective way that way. But the problem we're seeing again is that they have so much data. For one company in particular, it's terabytes of data. You've got to have a lot of seeds, if you remember the old torrents. You've got to have a lot of seeds to give you any kind of speed of downloading that.
Yeah, definitely. And with modem level and even modem level on bad old country infrastructure, we were seeing download speeds of like 3 kilobits per second. Like it was horrifically slow. We're going to pivot away from Klopp. I think we've clobbered them. Let's talk about a little bit about organizations' digital transfer, and really the issue here is one of who's your partner, what are they doing about security, and can you as a customer demand sort of evidence of this best practices? I would say that from small service providers, bespoke service providers that are offering cloud services, there's a little bit more flexibility, I think, in their approach to security. But you can't exactly ask for a tour of the Amazon data center where your data rests, and especially when we see the difficulty enterprise businesses have in migrating to the cloud. In some cases, organizations that are providing you services as an end user are in the exact same cloud, but they may not have the skills to do the cloud security. So there's this level of due diligence now that I think is starting to seep in as we quickly discover through, again, some Syjax research here, the astounding number of cloud-based vulnerabilities that we've seen. Do you want to comment a little bit about this, Chris?
Yeah, and it just keeps going up. I suspect if we review this again in 6 months' time, you'll see a continued uplift in this. And I think very much we're seeing that with over 300 new vulnerabilities identified in cloud since January 2023, we're seeing two things. One, we're seeing threat actors really looking to exploit and understand the vulnerabilities. And of course, they do then move onto the slide that you'll come onto a bit with the known exploited vulnerabilities sheets. But also, we're seeing the explosion of this SaaS approach with various different needs from companies being addressed by fast-produced and developed software. Often, as you've already said in the presentation so far, falling back on legacy code.
Yeah, and that might be the death of us. We're almost ready for our Q&A, but there's a couple more things that I want to share for you. If our own skill sets aren't good in terms of moving workloads into the cloud or even developing the new services in the cloud, and it doesn't align with the level of maturity required from SDLC, a software development lifecycle, or a DevOps sort of agile approach, one of the things that I would plead and beg organizations to really do is follow the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog called the CAV from CISA in the United States. It's critical, to be able to get in a timely manner warnings about particular systems or services out there that need to be secured, because it only goes into the CAV if it's a known exploited vulnerability, which means a threat actor is using it to break into your business. Now, a recent article and report came out, too, about the difficulties of the complexity of cloud-based environments. And you can see AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud there leading the pack at 60% in terms of misconfigurations. This tells me one very important takeaway. And this is because out of all three of these, AWS offers the most comprehensive security architecture and how do you use our product safely education, followed by Azure, and then, of course, Google Cloud coming up the rear a little bit in this one. This is really interesting data because what it does show us is that misconfiguration can lead directly to a compromise of your cloud systems. So one of the things that everybody was really on right away, and this is sort of more of the cautionary tale about kind of not doing enough research, is this thing came out and it said, there's a whole bunch of Citrix servers because of a combination of CVEs, which obviously we counted in our data, that were directly targeting this particular Citrix server. Now, Citrix is a particular problem because many folks have taken a Citrix server and actually migrated it to the cloud and to allow access to business services. However, there's also a cloud-based and appliance-based offering from Citrix itself. So here's an example of if you took something and you put it in the cloud, you have a problem. However, if you bought the service or the appliance, you don't. And I think this is a really important point, is we have to understand our infrastructure, have good IT asset management, and get some real understanding and truth when vulnerabilities are announced. Under what circumstances and what pieces of the puzzle are exploitable versus are we okay? Otherwise, if you don't take this intelligence-led to vulnerability management when you're talking about infrastructure and when you're talking about known exploited vulnerabilities, all you will be doing is sort of running around and fighting one fire followed by the next fire. Chris, are you increasingly seeing customers reach out to understand, the impact on their organizations in terms of like sudden, vulnerability disclosures where, Kevin Beaumont will tweet, "It's the end of the world as we know it"?
All the time. And this is where you see our approach of trying to read through all of the news that comes, all of this stuff that comes on Kev, and put out relevant information to our clients. It means that they don't have to come to us looking for that. We've already provided it to them with the relevant analyst comment on it to show them the so what. What does this mean strategically? What does it mean tactically? Very much drawing on your...
Just a tiny bit there.
I'm sorry, Ian, what was that?
I said you cut off just a tiny bit there.
My apologies. Yeah, no, I'm just saying absolutely. We've seen it from the clients. Our approach is to provide information to our clients when we see it, which saves them having to come to us to look for it. Usually we're ahead of Mr. Beaumont. Yeah, absolutely. The approach where we can say to our clients, the intelligence is this is the vulnerability. Strategically, that means A. Tactically, it means B. It puts them in the right place to react to the changes in that landscape.
And this is critical to combine that kind of information with experts like Rubrik that will help you architect and build and protect that cloud infrastructure, because it's really a combination of knowing what's going on, but also turning to expert advice and counsel when you're being tasked as a busy IT department that is, busy just barely able to survive what is happening right now, and then being told that now the plan is to digitally transform and move off TIN and move business services to the cloud. It's super complex, as we've shown up. The threat actors are ravenous, and that's why, the combination of people that know what they're doing is really, I think, the biggest solution we can do there. With that, over to Mr. David Rammel, who can ask us some of the tough questions.
Okay. We do have a couple minutes for questions, and let's get started. Lynn from the audience asked, with the rise of remote work and hybrid cloud models, how has the threat landscape evolved, and what security challenges does this present for organizations?
All right, well, download the MP4 of this. No, I'm just going to say that's a super good question because it comes back to that threat model. If an endpoint is hacked and that endpoint has credentials for cloud-based services, those cloud-based services are at risk. So if that's a payroll machine and the payroll system is delivered by SAS from the cloud, it puts that SAS application at risk. When it's a business system that has been digitally transformed to the cloud, and again, the credentials are lost, and especially with administrative level resources in the IT or in the development, that is the ball game. And we've seen time and time again organizations that don't implement things like multi-factor authentication for auth. They're not hiding their secrets appropriately. They're in the repositories, and all of that information is required by a threat actor to then move to the cloud. Opposite attack methodologies are compromise the cloud because of a misconfiguration or a vulnerable service that doesn't have compensating controls and infiltrate the actual physical network. It can go both ways. And this, I think, is the most important takeaway of this rep model. You're going to need compensating controls on both ends of the equation.
Okay, great. Let's just wrap this up with a couple of easy questions for you guys. Servan from the audience, who looks like he works for a question in India, is just asking for an explanation of a couple of acronyms he used. So he says, what exactly is a DDoS attack, and what is about SAS? Could you please answer those questions, and we'll wrap this up.
All right. Well, DDoS is a distributed denial of service attack. It's where many computers attempt to flood another your system with a bunch of garbage data or deliberately delay responses in order to degrade the performance of that computer. And these can be massive attacks measured in hundreds of gigabits per second because a whole bunch of compromised computers are being used to target your system. Now, SAS is a bit different than cloud, but SAS is a software as a service, a subscription-based service. Could be something like QuickBooks, for instance. Now, because it's financial accounting software and things like that, it's probably going to have very sensitive data in it, the financials for your organization. But the onus of the security for that falls on the organization that's providing that service, okay? The cloud services are what those services rest on. So you can own cloud services directly, or you could use a SaaS product that has its own cloud services as where it's hosted. And so this becomes, problematic. And if you are indeed in India, India's just passed some very interesting laws about where backups of your data need to be and where they need to be retained, which comes as no surprise in India, as also with the transfer of personal data. There's a new regime coming in India in terms of data protection. I think it's actually gone into effect. So these are very important questions to ask of your providers because where that data is very important to your customers, and of course, who's looking after it, and is it being transferred under the proper authorities?
All right, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian and Chris, for that excellent presentation and answering those questions.
Thanks for having us along.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsor, Rubrik, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great event. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our mid-year Cloud Security Check Summit, called Cloud Security Best Practices for 2023 and Beyond. Our speakers for this session are Dave Kula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist, AWS Solutions. Dave is a highly accomplished technology professional and Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, specializing in Microsoft Azure, hybrid cloud solutions, and cybersecurity. With over 20 years of experience in the IT industry, Dave has established himself as a trusted advisor to organizations of all sizes, helping them navigate the complex world of Microsoft technologies and optimizing their IT infrastructure. As a sought-after speaker and presenter, Dave has delivered engaging sessions at numerous industry conferences, sharing his experience and insights on topics ranging from cloud migrations and security to disaster recovery and infrastructure optimization. His ability to simplify complex concepts and provide practical guidance has earned him a reputation for delivering informative and actionable content. John's professional IT career began as a teenager, taking him on many wonderful adventures over the past 30 years. John's IT path started with programming but branched out quickly. Opportunities from the help desk to the corner office shaped his IT journey. Specializing in cybersecurity, cloud, and infrastructure technologies, John's broad skill set includes business systems, desktop and server OS, identity management, endpoint management, public-private hybrid cloud, network services, network architecture, cyber insurance, and cybersecurity. Passionate about giving back to the IT community, John develops relevant, timely content that IT pros can take advantage of immediately. Part of the MVP Days team, he develops both online and in-print content. In addition, John authored materials as a contributing editor for the petri.co.il online community, as well as senior contributor to Tom's IT Pro, Redmond Magazine, NetRix, and both Thomson Reuters Asptor books and Exec Blueprint publications. Take it away, Dave and John.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the kind introduction there, Chris. John, you're definitely winning the award for the longest introduction ever on a webinar.
Well, I just had to beat you out.
It is our distinguished pleasure, everyone, all the attendees that are on the line here today, for tuning into this Cloud Security Best Practices webinar that we're going to be delivering today. As always, this is the best part of my Friday, John. I get to hang out with you and discuss some super relevant content. So with that, let's get right into it, John. So I think one of the big things that we have to look at is, how has cloud security changed on us moving through 2023, like halfway through this year? It seems like almost every day it's top of mind to IT teams that I talk to, executives, and in general, just, people in industry. Security just seems to be our number one focus that we have, because keeping our organizations running and trying to keep the threat actors out is just so hard right now. So I know you've been doing a ton of work in the cyber insurance space, John, and you're dealing with this with adjusters and brokers all the time, trying to maintain coverage. What are you seeing out there?
Well, it seems like every time we get together, Dave, and we talk about this, whether it be on a webinar or just be over dinner, we're always like, wow, we said it was unprecedented before, and it's still unprecedented. And I will say it again now, right? Everything we think is going to happen in the cybersecurity world from a threat standpoint is worse than ever anticipated, right? So the big thing that I'm thinking of right now, what's just happened in just the last few weeks, is you look at the U.S. stance on Chinese cyber threats and some of the guidance coming out from our major agencies and that sort of thing. And then, even just recently with President Biden signing a ban on U.S. tech investments in China and that sort of thing. So that's really amping up. And, my personal opinion is that we're going to start seeing a significant uptick in the severity and frequency of the threats coming out of those PRC supported threats.
No, absolutely, John. Absolutely. And, it's all over the news. It's everywhere. We're seeing it almost every day and having to deal with this. And the vulnerabilities just seem to be getting, more and more secure, more and more severe as we're looking at this. And I think, I was listening to the last session, and a couple of really key things in there was, really focusing and following what's happening in industry is huge for us, right? So, as we move forward here, just looking at some of our best practices for this year and kind of what we've been implementing, this is a challenge for a lot of organizations. Is, a lot of our teams, we didn't have dedicated cybersecurity professionals, dedicated cybersecurity teams inside of our organization. So what I'm finding, John, is a lot of this talent that we have has been homegrown talent that we have inside of these organizations. Maybe some transition skill sets that we have. We'll bring on a few experts to maybe form that team, but a lot of that knowledge has been transitioned from within. So our IT professionals that are jumping into the cybersecurity space here, I'm finding that a lot of them, this wasn't their first career choice, career path. They're kind of being thrust into this, and it's a big learning curve. There's a lot of tools that are out there that need to be learned, and more importantly with that, when we take a look at the deficiencies inside of our infrastructure, a lot of this is rearing its head as we start to move into a hybrid world where, we're connecting our on-prem infrastructure up to cloud. I'm finding that a lot of those cloud deployments are not actually configured properly. And we saw that in the last presentation. I think the number resonated with me. It was like 60% with Google and maybe 57% with Azure are in a misconfigured state. And I would probably say that that's pretty accurate, because from what we see out there, there's so many different knobs to turn and widgets to have to work through. It's hard to configure that. So from a cloud security best practice, you're going to get lots of gold nuggets from John and myself here going through this webinar. But one of the big ones here is that there are security advisors built right into the platform. Microsoft Defender for Cloud will actually give recommendations for the deficiencies and holes that you have inside of your platform. Follow that. You want to lock that down tight. Like locking this down is one of the big keys to making sure that you've got a solid platform. So John, from a cloud security best practices, what are your thoughts about not just the technical side of this, but kind of the operational side of things from a cloud security perspective? Is it hard for you to operationalize the teams that you work with, especially around cloud security?
Absolutely. I mean, first off, we're in an area where we've evolved from cloud security into cyber warfare, and that's very relevant to this topic in a moment. But I want to back up for a second and say that cybersecurity, as we've thought about it in the last 5 years, is completely different than anything that came before that, right? So anybody who's been in IT for, I'd say, 10 years, probably, to your point, didn't get in to be a cybersecurity expert. I mean, back 10 years ago, we were worried about antivirus and some anti-malware, and, it was annoying, but it really didn't shut down companies. We didn't have ransomware. We didn't have a lot of these different things that permeated, and you'd have a system admin, and they took care of the anti-malware apps, and that was kind of it. Now, show me an IT department where every member of that department doesn't have some function related to cybersecurity. And if you could show me that department, I would tell you that it's doing it wrong, because cybersecurity is so broad and has such a high level impact today that I don't care if you're a cloud administrator, a database administrator, a network engineer, whatever you are, you need to be focusing on cybersecurity. And it's hard. Now I get back to my point about cyber warfare. It's really hard for a lot of people, even those of us that have been in IT for a long time, to operationalize what we need, the skills we need right now, because cyber warfare is like any warfare. It changes, it adapts, all your responses are based on what you're analyzing in the moment, you're adapting to, and then you're overcoming, right? We have to pivot daily to face the threats that we have coming at us. And, it's hard to teach somebody how to pivot. That's something that's built from experience and the ability to take in what you're seeing and compare that quickly in your mind with all the knowledge you've gained and everything else, right? And then make a decision and move on. It's not like we can just hand a manual or, the good old help desk knowledge base that says, hey, when you get that one Monday morning event that you and I talk about all the time where you come in and the whole place is ransomed and everything else, you don't look that up in a database on what to do. You have to be very adaptive on the fly. Hopefully I articulated that right. But what do you think about that point of having to articulate on the fly?
Oh, right. When it's happening and you're in the middle of some type of security event, you're not going and Googling your solutions. That's absolutely not going to happen. Great point, John. Just a quick piece of housekeeping for all of our wonderful guests on the webinar today is John and I love to take questions in line. So if anything that we're talking about is really resonating or you want us to dig in a little bit more, you just have some general questions, feel free to fire away in your Q&A panel. We'll get to absolutely as many as possible. Now, one of the big pieces that we have to go through in looking at our designs is our cloud security architecture. And this cloud security architecture that we have is something that I find that a lot of organizations, they don't start here, John. They've had somebody along the way from their team spin up a tenant, because it's not hard to spin up your cloud tenant. You have a credit card, you can enable this. You can get hybrid functionality back to your on-prem infrastructure. The problem is that there are a lot of items in there that need to be tweaked. And with that, the next gold nugget that you're going to have is, from a Microsoft perspective, they give you what are called Azure blueprints and policies to make sure that you're compliant and conformant with your infrastructure requirements that you have. So if you have some type of, hospital requirements for HIPAA, or you've got, the old SOX compliancy, or you've got DOD standards that you have to comply to because you've got some military contracts. This is a big one for your architecture, is just make sure that you can actually start that tenant secure. And I've actually run into situations now, John, where, we've now moved into a world where 5, 6, 7 years have gone on, but with cloud infrastructure, and the individuals that originally set that up are gone from the organization. We've lost a lot of that intellectual property surrounding the builds, and it's kind of like, okay, we're in a process of reverse engineering everything now. And this is a real problem, because the threat actors are going to exploit any of those holes they possibly can. And so we're actually looking at, with some of our customers, is a parallel build where we can start secure and then migrate resources over. And so that seems pretty extreme, but it's really no different than doing a data center migration or anything like that. So the tools are out there, the platforms are out there, use them. You're not on your own with this. Are you seeing similar things, John, with, that the cloud infrastructure just not being secure?
Absolutely. Those numbers that, they brought up in the previous session, and you said, hey, these are stellar numbers. I would actually say that I bet those numbers are pretty low. I bet that if you really dug in, you'd find that, upwards of 70% of cloud tenants have some misconfiguration as it relates to basic security settings, and it stems from what you just really well articulated, the fact that, a lot of these tenants were set up because there was this business drive to get into the cloud, to move up, some operational or system, and the people setting it up weren't cloud trained or cloud experts. They were next finishing their way through things, and and then we built upon that. Even if you just look at something like identity management with Azure Active Directory now, right? And it first started out and people set up ADFS connections to it to kind of link it to their on-prem AD, and then it became DirSync, and now it's AD Connect. But it has gotten so much more robust. Azure AD, or Entra ID as it's known now, right, as part of the Entra rebranding, is core to everything pretty much through the Azure ecosystem, through the entire tenant when it comes to identity. And many of the cases, it's based on that original next finish setup. So, of course, it's probably got some problems. And I just wanted to point something out, Dave, that I think many of our attendees may not realize. As you mentioned earlier, I focus a lot on protecting organizations through proper cyber insurance and that sort of thing. Not from the standpoint of the insurance companies. My goal is to understand how the insurance companies act so that the fellow IT pros and organizations that we work with can make sure that they have the right coverage and the lowest premiums and all that stuff. But more importantly, that when there's an event and a company is shut down, that they're going to get checks. They're going to get the help they need. So I wanted to bring out that right in the application of one of the major underwriters of modern cyber insurance policies, there is this we'll say screening question. Do you currently use or have plans in the next year to use the services of a cloud service or other outsourced service provider? And as soon as you answer yes, you have to answer two additional questions. What impact would an interruption or cessation of such services have on the applicant's ability to meet customer contractual obligations? None, slight, or significant. And does the applicant's DR and business continuity plan specifically address restoration and recovery of business operations provided by a cloud service provider? So I know that was long-winded, but I just wanted to get out there that if the insurance company is calling out that cloud operations and cloud security is important enough that it could make or break whether you get a policy, I think that shows us a lot about why you and I do what we do, and we tell people, hey, it's time to take this cloud security even more serious than we have been.
Well, and for the last 2 years, John, we've been talking about DR and cyber insurance and in a variety of formats. And we've always mentioned the fact that, a single DR plan and business continuity plan is not enough anymore, like the traditional fire, flood, all of those pieces in the event that you have some type of security incident. We've always mentioned now that you need a second one for cyber threats. And I think now that, that we're thinking about this, I think that organizations should actually have a third, which is their cloud DR playbook as well. Because that's going to be a totally different platform potentially to recover to. And now that the cyber insurance vendors are actually specifically calling this out, I think that this could be a new norm for us coming into 2023. And I know it's a lot because there's a lot to operationalize with this. But when you're moving platforms, you've got to operationalize on each of those platforms as well. Just because it's easy to next finish doesn't mean it's easy to secure, maintain, and operate. All right, next one, John. Identity and access management. This is actually one of the areas that I do believe that our cloud security posture compared to our on-prem posture is a lot better because of the fact that, those, privileged identity management solutions, just-in-time access solutions are built right into the solution. We're not having to go get third-party products to kind of maintain that access level. Couple little gold nuggets for you. If you don't know what privileged identity management is, this is something that you really need to take as a takeaway for your cloud tenant. It's the ability for us to have low privileged users, right? So we want to have that principle of kind of zero trust. I want low privileged accounts, and I want to elevate when I need to do specific tasks. Well, those functions through role-based access control are built right into the tenant for you, and it's very granular. It's extremely granular. It takes some time to go through the configurations, but from a security perspective, that is a great piece. The second thing is you need to make sure through your identity management that you're turning on multi-factor authentication on any of those accounts that are touching anything to do with your tenant in the cloud. And then the third thing is make sure that you are configuring your conditional access policies, and you're restricting access to only those locations, IP addresses, locales that really need to access your tenant and configurations. So those three are really key, and by default, it's kind of in that next finish setup, John. And those ones there are really huge for me with identity management. How about yourself?
Without a doubt, identity management is one of those things that every time you and I talk, we spend a lot of time focused on this because it makes or breaks what we're talking about. And I can go right back to that same kind of cyber insurance discussion and read the very next question, actually, that came up from the next topic. It's almost like we planned this. And the question is, do you have a formalized process when privileged access is granted? And then it says, if yes, privileged access is granted on need-only, least privileged basis and subject to continuous technological, operational, and security review, audit, and process improvement. So pretty much everything you just said.
Awesome, John. Awesome. All right. So our next one here, data encryption and privacy. Well, when we look at our cloud security posture, one of the things that we need to understand is that data is the new currency for these threat actors that are out there. You know, it can be a lot of work to actually go through and whole level encrypt an organization, worry about dwell time, worry about all of these pieces, John. In certain cases, it's just so much easier to go after your confidential data that you've got, maybe sitting in a non-encrypted state because maybe that's on some type of storage account that you haven't locked down. You've locked down lots of other things, but maybe you haven't locked that down. So just to go through and exfiltrate all of that data and, you know, really take advantage of organizations that don't have good compliancy policies in place or have the ability to capture what data is potentially leaving her organization. This is huge. And this is something that at an organizational level, you need to be taking and going through holistic training with your organizations that, hey, HR department, it's really not cool to be sharing those social security numbers out there. It's really not cool to be, you know, emailing around confidential information. And how many times, John, have we gotten the answer back? Well, it's just an email. Well, quick reminder for everyone, email by default is not encrypted. It runs out there in plain text, right? And so, you know, encrypting these things, not just data at rest, because I think that's what most have focused on. We're starting to get pressure now to encrypt data in flight on the network as well, right, John? Where it's not just, hey, I want to encrypt the park data to protect it. No, I want to be able to ensure that I can encrypt end-to-end communications, right? So if you have some type of insecure platform, how do we secure that end-to-end? And this is challenging for a lot of organizations. And we go back to a technology that's been around for a very long time. We use it with most of our VPNs that are out there. But hey, another little gold nugget for everyone. IPsec is your friend on the internal network. We can encrypt the communication between two endpoints, between servers. We can basically isolate traffic that we don't want to be seen on the network. And the overhead that we face for encrypting that traffic actually isn't that much of a degradation that it's going to impact business operations. So you go back to this again. And these things can actually be configured through group policies on your Windows desktops, on your servers. And so we can protect these environments because right now, for me, John, we talk about security boundaries, and that security boundary, this seems to have gotten smaller and smaller over the years to the point that I almost feel that when we're on the general network in most organizations, you might as well be on the wide open internet. And so we have to treat the infrastructure as hostile as such, and encrypting that data in flight is huge, and making sure that we protect, because I think it was just a few weeks ago, we had a contractor come in one of the organizations that you and I work with, and they ended up plugging in one of their laptops onto one of the networks, and they brought in some bad stuff. And this happens. Most organizations probably seen similar things. So, John, in regards to data encryption and privacy, any color commentary to add in there?
Just a little bit. You know, I was starting with your comment about email. What I tell people about email is if you wouldn't walk into a public park and shout whatever it is you're about to send in that email, don't send the email. Not unless you're encrypting it. And most people have no clue how to encrypt an email, right? Most users. So certainly you shouldn't be sending any PII. Second, the data encryption and at rest, that is on every insurance application. And let me give people a kind of a breakdown of what happens here. You have an event, and now you're losing money because you can't ship product or make product or do whatever it is you do for customers that let you bill them. And so you're trying to recover from this event, and that takes time, and you want your cyber insurance to come in and pay. Well, they come in and they begin to do a forensic analysis. They always begin with that analysis, and they find that on your application, you check that you have data at rest and in transit, and they don't see data. They will immediately slow down the process to investigate whether or not the successful attack leveraged unencrypted data in any form. And even if at the end of the day, they find that, hey, it didn't have anything to do with it, it may have just taken you an extra 8 weeks before you got any money from that insurance company. And during that 8 weeks, you still had payroll to make and bills to pay and all those different things, and you better have a big enough checkbook that you can write those checks. That's what I mean when I say when you need the insurance, it pays quickly. But to get that, you have to not only check the answers that they want to see, but you have to bust your rear to make sure that you comply. And even beyond the endpoint to server and everything else, you gotta include MDM in that, right? Mobile devices. A lot of people, I go in and I see that they don't enforce pins on their mobile devices. They tell people to put them, but they don't actually enforce them through, an MDM policy. And I tell them, you better do that immediately, because if a pin isn't set, the encryption isn't enabled. So, that's enough on that soapbox, but it's super important to get this data encryption at rest and in transit into your daily operational functions.
Oh, and that can be a huge project for a lot of organizations, and we understand that. We're not making light of this situation, but it is that important. Okay, so the next one here, I'll lead in with a question that I got written into me, John, and it was our security team is not a 24/7 shop. They don't work every hour of the day. They're humans. They work their 8-hour shifts, and our business is kind of a 9 to 5 shop. But with that, most of the attacks seem to come in the middle of the night, and they try to leverage the fact that they know that our team members are sleeping. Is there an importance to partner up with an outsourced security operations center that offers managed detection and response and the ability to potentially isolate, attack PCs and try to contain the situation? Is that important in the world that we live in right now, or are the tools enough by themselves?
The tools are definitely not enough by themselves. I equate this to you're in a football game, or my buddy Dave has me learning to love the awesomeness of hockey. So you're in a hockey match. One person, no matter how great they are, can't win against an entire well-fielded opposing team, right? And that's the way I kind of look at cyber attacks. Even if you have somebody internally who's dedicated 40 hours a week to cybersecurity, a lot of these threats that we're facing off are teams that have budgets that are bigger than our IT budgets, that are funded by nation states, that are all these different things. So partnering up with other companies that have a robust set of resources targeted directly at cybersecurity just allows you to get not only a more robust defense against attacks, but also if you need to remediate, you've got a much more robust set of resources available. It just rounds you out, and it gives you a at least fighting chance to win the game.
Yeah, and I like to, going back, we'll date ourselves here a little bit, John, but, back in the day, Nobody got fired for buying, Big Blue and IBM infrastructure. And now I like to say that nobody gets fired for spending too much money on security. And with that, I think one of the big ones here, John, that I think that we should talk about is the importance of an adaptive incident response plan. And so that incident response plan is something that, goes hand in hand with your disaster recovery playbook. But when we talk about cloud security monitoring, that's one piece. Incident response and who you have put on your SWAT team in the event that something happens is really key. We were talking about this at a recent conference that we were at the Tech Mentor Conference in Redmond a few weeks ago, John, and this was having your security professionals on retainer in the event that something happens that can help engage with your incident response plan. And making sure that there's actual availability with those teams is really key, because trust me, you're going to want as much talent as you can possibly get your hands on when that one Monday morning comes around. But as part of that incident response plan, one of the things that most organizations are missing is the actual strategic planning that goes around the day of the incident and pre-planning. And what I mean by that is, if there's a critical service that is inside of your infrastructure, you have to mimic what would happen if that goes away. If the business comes back and says, hey, you know what, we can go back to pen and paper for weeks if these servers are off. Okay, so what? In the next few weeks, I go and pull the pin on that thing and it's off for a couple hours just to see what happens. I'm not saying that that's strategically a good thing to do, but how else are you going to really test this? There's no time to go through and test every single service. And along with that, you have to model and practice that incident response plan. And so, John, we all know that government organizations have been targeted. And the city of New Orleans was targeted, and they've actually been very forthcoming about, their incident response plan and how they were able to recover from a cyber attack that happened recently. And with that, their CIO had mentioned that they actually practiced their incident response plan. They brought all the team members in. Everyone knew what to do. And they had just practiced that a few weeks prior to their big attack. For example, it wasn't a shocker to the organization when they had to go, rip the cords out from the internet. They had to shut down firewalls. They had to start containing things. It wasn't a shock to the organization. It wasn't a shock to the IT team. They were a well-oiled machine, and they were able to recover. So my point to this is, no matter how good of an incident response plan you draft up on paper, if you don't do biannual testing and preparation of that, modeling, we call it red teaming, blue teaming, but even beyond that, testing that, you're going to be in a world of hurt when your one Monday morning comes around. So just having stuff on pen and paper to appease our cyber insurance or our auditors is one side of it. We actually need to follow through with that. And so what are your thoughts, John, on just like following through with, the incident response plans and making sure that they are viable?
Well, we've said it for years when it comes to backup and restore, right? If you don't test your backups, you don't have backups. And it's the same thing when it comes to incident response. And I think, something that when we meet up with fellow IT pros, such as at Tech Mentor and other events, one of the things that a lot of people are surprised about is that from our perspective and the insurance company's perspective and financial auditors' perspective, disaster recovery, business continuity, and incident response are three separate areas. So having a DR plan doesn't constitute a business continuity or an incident response plan. You need all three, and all three need to be periodically tested to ensure that they actually produce the intended results and are fully capable of addressing the situation, right? So to your point, sometimes that means you gotta tell the company, hey, it's going to be expensive because it's going to cost some money. I'm going to bring the entire manufacturing floor down for an hour, but you need to do it to be able to prove that when that one Monday morning comes, and to have the confidence in yourself, to be honest, that when that one Monday morning comes, that you're not going to be stressed out and running around wondering what to do. It'll be muscle memory. You'll just do it because you've practiced it.
Oh, and that muscle memory is huge. It's so huge because, like I said, there's no time to go start, Googling how the experts are fixing things when you're under attack. All right. So from a compliancy perspective, some of the frameworks that are out there, we'll talk a little bit about cloud compliance, governance, these pieces, but there are specific requirements that are written into a lot of contracts that require you to meet certain compliancy standards, especially with your cloud platforms that you have. And your cloud platforms, this is huge, Sean, because this isn't just your tenant that you house your infrastructure in. This is also your Office 365 infrastructure, which lives in the cloud. This is also all of the SaaS applications that you're connecting into. And so a really interesting one for me is I had a conversation a few weeks ago with one of the attendees at Tech Mentor, and they said that from their cloud compliancy standpoint, if you don't have the most rigid security standards for your SaaS application, they're not even going to look at you as a potential vendor. They want to make sure that this isn't just like some homegrown application that somebody's building in their garage, not following through on standards. And that was an interesting concept for me, that, that this is the new thought process, that we always used to worry about how secure are we, but how secure are they is, I think, the real question that needs to be asked here from a compliancy perspective, because I want to do business-to-business transactions. And you expect me to either open up a tunnel to you, you expect me to share data with you, you expect me to do a lot of different things that require one word, John, and that one word is trust. And so how do you establish and maintain that trust when you're dealing with compliance? Because that's a big one for me, because if your platform on the other end isn't secure, that could potentially be a backdoor to get into my data or the data that I'm sharing with you, right? And so from that governance perspective, I know that I've seen you put this in place with some of the organizations that you work with, that governance piece of, data, platform, all of those. Does that have to start from, the top down in organizations so that there is a level of understanding so that we're not always fighting the battle of just locking things down? Or where do you even start with cloud compliance and governance inside of an organization, John?
Well, for me, that always starts at the C-suite level and works its way down, because security is no longer a thing we do. It is a culture that we exist in, that we exude, that we share, that we further. And if you want a culture change in an organization, it has to be supported and in some cases driven from the highest levels of the organization, right? If you can share the value and the strategy of security with the CEO, the CIO, all the folks that make up the executive team at your organization, and they really buy into, yes, protecting our cyber assets is critical to the long-term viability of our company or our organization, then they're going to support budget investments. They're going to support those managed service agreements. They're going to support the pushback when users come and say, you know what, IT makes it really inconvenient for me. My data has to be encrypted and, it's slower now on my machine, or I don't really like the fact that I have to change my password so often, and this MFA thing, I'm really tired of having to approve every time I log in. Whatever their complaint is, and we all know the complaints are nonstop. Well, when they bubble up to that senior manager, executive, even director level, those people are defending you. They're defending IT. They're defending the stance that security is our culture. Security first. 2 words, straightforward, hard to implement, but once it becomes cultural in your organization, it's a lot easier for you, I'll tell you that.
No, absolutely, John. It's definitely a challenge for a lot of organizations that are out there. And kind of moving into that thought process, now we're needing help, okay? So in regards to help, where can we take and can we get help for taking and looking at the vendors that we're working with from a cloud perspective? For me, one of the big areas that I see often inside of organizations is they struggle to try and figure things out on their own. And there is help available, and it's available via your vendors. And even if you're not on with a giant service agreement with your cloud provider, they do have very good support platforms. So even just like a credit card level support with Azure, for example, you're having problems configuring your privileged identity management or anything that's got to hook into cloud for them that they're providing a service for, please walk away from this webinar, cut as many tickets as you have to with your vendor. They will help you learn, configure, and go through this stuff. You're not on your own. And so from a vendor management perspective, I find that it's often too late by the time we're cutting these tickets, right? And I always used to say that when I would walk into an organization, okay, what's the emergency? What's happening? Let's try to put a little fence around, what the exact situation is that we're going through. Okay, it's some type of an issue that we're having with Office 365. Perfect. Now we can kind of narrow the scope around this. The very first thing that we should be doing is saying, okay, what's the problem we're having? The problem is maybe we're not getting mail flow or something like that. Some cloud-related service mail is not flowing. People are freaking out, whatever it is. And so the first thing I would always go into organizations, and I forget to tell them this now even myself, cut the ticket with the vendor before you even start the troubleshooting process, because it could take minutes or hours to get them on the line. After that ticket is cut, then we can go back to the troubleshooting process ourselves, and hopefully by the time they come around, we can take and we can, have a little better strategy around this for how we're going to deal with, the solutions. The other thing is you can contractually get higher levels of support and dedicated levels of support with that. So make sure that you understand what that really looks like. And so, John, we're gonna talk with one more, and then we'll take a couple questions here. Give me a sec here. And this one here is more geared towards yourself, and it's the cloud security training and awareness piece. This is not just for employees. This is also for educating, executives, IT professionals, and everybody about what's going on. So, John, what are your thoughts there?
We've already talked about a security-first culture within an organization and engaging all areas of the organization. But, when we get into the kind of what that means operationally, it means that every member of the IT team should be looking at cybersecurity and keeping up to date and that sort of thing as it relates to their function as something they do as part of their continuing education. But you should also be having conversations with all of your user base, whether it be one-to-one, whether it be through group trainings, whether it be through sending email updates, or even I've sent some brief video clip updates. But you need to be presenting them with tips and strategies on how to truly implement the concept of a security-first culture, right? Whether it be from the things that we've been doing for quite a while, like simulating phishing emails and seeing who clicks what and then remediating that, or it be something as simple as talking with the HR department about the offboarding process and how, there really needs to be a timely interaction between HR and IT to ensure that not only is physical access secured to a facility, but, access into our cloud systems, our on-prem systems, all that's handled. So it has to be a constant communication between all the layers and all the individuals that make up an organization. Okay, Dave, I can't hear you. Maybe we've lost you for a second.
No, sorry, John, I was muted. So we've got a few questions that have taken in that we've had as write-ins here, John. And so one of the big questions that we had that's been real, boiling topic as well for the last few weeks is there was something that was going on with security cameras and infrastructure, and you had briefly mentioned the states of, the infrastructure and Chinese hacking into, U.S. critical infrastructure. What does this mean for organizations that, might fall into that category? I know you've been frontline dealing with this right now. So what's going on with, our microprocessor chips, all of that stuff?
So where we're really focusing a lot of scrutiny to try and understand better what the threat level and the impact of the threat is in the area of industrial controls. And you might hear about it in the news from talking about, okay, well, Chinese malware wants to disrupt the industrial controls for water treatment systems or the electrical grid, right? So the power distribution systems to military bases. But the thing to remember is most of those systems are integrated with the local communities where these military bases exist, and they use the same technology as all of those systems that run every community's water treatment system or sewage treatment or power distribution, all those things. So, there's a lot of activity going on right now to see, one, is there malware already embedded in these things just waiting to be activated? And two, what is the sensible risk of how these controls are programmed and whether or not we feel malware could be written to, infect them? Of course, we know it's possible because Stuxnet proved that to us many years ago. But this concept of industrial controls goes beyond that. We saw this during COVID. What happens if our trucks aren't moving products from warehouses to stores? What happens if our manufacturing infrastructure comes down because all the automation it relies on is impacted? So there's this huge level of concern and scrutiny right now of we're just going to keep up this amped up rhetoric with China tit for tat, and it's kind of like a Cold War mentality where we feel that it's imminent that they're going to somehow want to disrupt our functionality. And it's not just the U.S., right? It's pretty much all the Western economies. So you could be in Canada or the U.K., anywhere in the EU pretty much, and this stuff could impact you. So there's a lot of effort right now going on to understand what we can do to better protect these industrial control systems, which, by the way, unfortunately, many of them are practically as old as I am, and I'm not young anymore. So
Well, awesome. And with that, John, I think what we're going to do is we probably want to take a quick break here, and we'll hand that back over to Chris. Guys, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to John and myself. It's always a pleasure, and we'll see everyone again soon.